On my return home, I found everyone alarmed as to what had happened to me. People feared I might have even been taken prisoner by the enemy. My children had remained in hiding in a private family. Paris still seemed fairly quiet. Only the upper classes were excited. I, satisfying that I had done my duty to the end, was prepared to wait further events with courage and resignation. Our troops were formed in the neighborhood of Paris. The army wished to resist under the walls of the capital and save our national honor. The Chamber of Deputies was busy drawing up a constitution, and the provisional government, meanwhile, negotiated with the foreign powers, seeking to prevent the shedding of any more French blood and to ensure at least the country's position as a nation. The women I knew met every morning at my house. Each of them had a different idea of what should be done and kept me informed of what Paris was saying. They were all excited and nervous, while I astonished them with my calm. Yet this was easily understandable. Their futures were undecided. Mine was settled. I had done no harm. There was no favor I wished to ask for my only desire was to withdraw from society, and I imagined that nothing would be simpler. I listened to the plans of those about me with that sympathetic interest that one extends to one's friends, and I was probably the only one to notice how impossible those plans were. The unanimous wish seemed to be not to have the Bourbons return to power. It was said they would bring back with them new humiliations of our national pride, along with a general reactionary policy. It seemed unlikely that Napoleon II would be allowed to reign. One day the Duc d'Orléans would be suggested. The next it would be the Emperor Alexander's brother, or a republic, or the Prince of Orange, or the King of Saxony. In short, everybody picked out the monarch he preferred and offered him the crown of France. Some mentioned Prince Eugene, but I stopped them at once, saying that my brother would never accept the throne to the detriment of the son of his benefactor. I asked my friends to be good enough not to speak of the subject again. General Grenier sent me word that the question had come up in the Chamber of Deputies, but he had felt he was acting in accordance with my wishes and those of my brother in avoiding any further mention of it or any debate on the subject. I expressed my thanks. The provisional government, too feeble for such a critical moment, felt that France's safety was to be obtained only through negotiations, whereas the army refused indignantly the idea of making any concession to the foreigners. The latter were drawing near the capital. Terror reigned. People were constantly accused of treason. The Duc de Trente-Fouché frequently sent his daughter's governess to see Mademoiselle Cochelet, either to warn me of impending dangers or to inform me of the hopes he entertained. One day she asked to see me personally. She read me a copy of the letter Fouché had just written. I do not remember to whom, for not seeing any sign of defensive measures being taken or any spirit of decision being displayed, I considered the cause of France already lost. Once more, we were surrendering without a struggle to the foreign invader, and unless we were prepared to offer some sort of resistance, I felt that all discussions were vain and futile. Consequently, I listened to each person's opinions with the completest indifference. I remember, however, that this letter of Fouché was written to combat vehemently any idea of accepting the Duc d'Orléans. He cleverly pointed out that the Duke's ascension to the throne would result in new misfortunes for the country generally, and that it would be better to accept, after all, the elder branch of the Bourbons. The letter also stated that Napoleon II was the only ruler who could assure the prosperity of France and European peace. One day, a Monsieur Courtois, a former member of the Republican Party, called at my house. I did not know who he was. He came as delegate from the colonels commanding the various regiments assembled at La Villette. Their plan was to kidnap the members of the provisional government suspected of being in touch with the Bourbons and summon the emperor back to defend his capital. Monsieur Courtois had been sent to see me on behalf of the army to find out if the emperor had already actually left. I assured my visitor he had. and at the same time did my best to combat an enterprise which might lead to disastrous results. I knew the integrity of the Duc de Visson's Caulaincourt, the patriotism of Carnot, and doubted if Ivan Fouché would betray his country. The Emperor having left, there was no other man capable of gaining the support of all political parties and saving France. At such moments, the gravest danger is that of civic unrest. Without a leader, without unity of purpose, what can one accomplish? I heard later that the Emperor had stopped at Rambouillet and spent the night. Was he aware of what the army was planning? Did he expect to be summoned, to be appealed to be forced into an attempt to save the country? I fancy so, but at that time I believed he was already a long way off. The troops who were discontented with what was going on received orders to pass around the capital but not enter it. Stories of pillaging were spread about so as to alarm Parisians. They were made to believe that French soldiers, whose only idea was to combat the enemy, were more dangerous than the enemy himself. To refute these slanders, the generals, on their way to the other side of Paris, marched through it from end to end in spite of the order not to do so. Their march was an entirely orderly one. All the trained soldiers declared that the Prussians had committed a grave mistake in marching toward Versailles, and that it would be easy to defeat them by making an attack from Saint-Denis. The government, still believing its negotiations would be successful and imagining that conditions were the same as in 1814, watched unconcernedly the approach of an enemy who, it thought, shared its delusions. The habit of considering itself one great nation gives a country a haughty attitude, which it retains in spite of what may happen. Yet if it lacks the energy to defend its rights, this attitude is nothing but an empty sham. If the chamber, still occupied with the Constitution, desired to imitate the stoicism of the Roman Senate, it should have also been prepared to imitate its model by receiving a triumph, a council who had been defeated because he still believed in his country's prowess. The memory of the emperor's exile forced on him because he had failed and because the enemy insisted upon it will always shame those who witnessed it. These liberals, these energetic patriots whom France should honor since they defended so courageously its rights and its liberties, lost their cause because they separated it from the one man who could have saved them. To be sure, the position was a critical one. Those in office found themselves confronted either with the necessity of accepting again absolute authority or surrendering their country to the foreign invader. They would have done better to place their confidence in the promises of the victorious warrior. It was the desire for freedom that made them enslave themselves. I have heard it said often enough, and I cannot deny the fact that the authority of a legal constitution is preferable to that of a single man. But at this moment, the memory of all the great things the emperor had accomplished filled my mind to the exclusion of everything else. He had not rescued the country from anarchy and chaos, established a throne founded on the essential equality of man, increased France's fame abroad, reestablished its finances, religion, industry, and social order. Had he not accomplished a host of other glorious and useful acts which the nation had benefited by because they were the product of his genius? Yet the man who had done so much was forsaken. He and his faithful friends found themselves exposed to all sorts of dangers, including the schemes of revenge which the enemies might entertain. Here indeed was food for thought. When I yielded to my emotions, I accused the French of being ungrateful, unjust, and unstable in their affections. At such times, I recalled with acute sorrow the day when, still quite young, I had read Life of Hannibal. I was hurt and indignant over his sad fate. The emperor, he was consul at the time, said to me, "That is what happens to almost all great men." My mother and I exchanged glances, for already he was rather great himself. Our position became dangerous. Royalist exiles began to re-enter the capital in disguise. Monsieur de Vitrolles had been released from prison by the Duc de Trente Fouché, General Exelsmann, having heard of it, caused him to be again arrested and confined in a room at Vaugirard, where his troops were stationed. The general went to Paris to spend the evening. When he returned, Monsieur de Vitrolles had again escaped. Monsieur Hyde de Neuville, compromised in the affair of the infernal machine, but escaping thanks to the help of Baron de Vaux, was now hiding in Paris. He called on Monsieur de Vaux and told him he would see that I was not harmed if I would sign, and persuade my friends to sign a paper urging all the generals I knew to go over to the Bourbons. He displayed a list already filled with the names of prominent marshals and generals who had agreed to do so. I replied that everyone was free to do as he pleased, that I would not undertake to influence anyone's opinion or actions, that I had no favors to ask in my own behalf, and that I would not sign. Meanwhile, the French troops were passing through Paris without provoking the least disorder. Many officers came to see me in the evening. I had never seen such a martial spirit as that which animated the younger officers at a time when many of those higher in rank were already making peace with the Bourbons. These older soldiers considered that the return of the Bourbons to the throne was inevitable, but that whoever the king might be, it was the foreigners who were really to be feared. I pitied men whose personal interests blinded them to such an extent. I regretted that I was not a man, for I felt that all was not yet lost. If France only knew how to take advantage of the ardor of all these youths, it could at least defend its national interests and not throw itself blindly on the mercy of the conquerors. But what could a woman do? Arouse people's imagination, lead them into dangers which she could neither share nor control? I should have felt that such an action would be not only rash but criminal. I was not a queen in France. I was only obeying my impulse as a woman and as a daughter of France. Therefore, I forced myself to listen to all sorts of plans without encouraging the policy of defense, which I felt so urgently needed, but which, since it was in accordance with my personal interests, I was the more reluctant to advise. At the same time, when the Duc de Bassano came to inform me that it had been suggested that the seat of the government be transferred to Blois, I warmly approved this measure. Everything seemed to me preferable to surrender without conditions to the enemy. From Blois, at least, surrounded by faithful troops, it would be possible to obtain certain concessions. But none of these plans came to anything, and I heard nothing further about the matter. General Excelmans, who was ready to take risks in spite of the orders to be cautious, beat the Prussians near Versailles. In this engagement, Colonel de Briqueville, whom I had seen the day before, was seriously wounded. In spite of the pain he was in, he wrote me, telling me to reassure people who were alarmed and to do what I could to prevent Paris from capitulating. I had nothing to do with the matter. Meanwhile, the Prussians drew nearer. Malmaison was almost sacked. It was thought the emperor was there. Young Monsieur de Brac, who was in command of the bridge of Neuilly, was obliged to charge several times in order to save this house, which we had so recently left. It was his courage and devotion that saved the precious objects I had left behind. I admired him enough to be glad to accept this favor from him. A capitulation, the terms of which were not fully executed, surrendered Paris to the Allies and forced the army to withdraw toward the Loire. I was urged to go there also. Monsieur de Brac came to offer to conduct me there, escorted by his entire regiment, and promised to protect me from all possible dangers. But was I the sort of woman who follows an army? It was only from the Allied sovereigns that I could hope to obtain the means for passing through their lines without difficulty, in order to reach Switzerland, where I wished to live. The English ruled Paris. The army had left. Louis XVIII was approaching, and still people clung to the emblems of the empire. The outburst of enthusiasm for the royal cause, which was to have become also that of the nation, failed to materialize. People believed, or said they believed, that it was I alone who was responsible for its non-appearance. Consequently, the royalists and the foreigners hated and feared me. Some excuse had to be found by which so many people's wounded pride could explain the silence that greeted the return of the Bourbons. The king was at Saint-Denis. I was walking about my garden when I saw cabs go by filled with wild-looking men who, when they recognized me, made threatening gestures and shouted insults. They seemed on the point of getting out and attacking me. The Duc de Trente-Fouché warned me that he was doing everything he could to protect me, but that I was in serious danger, and that I must be very careful, as people were more actively hostile to me than ever. This was why, the day following the king's entry into Paris, some young members of his bodyguard, having distinguished themselves by wrecking a cafe, set out towards my house, doubtless to do the same there. The police and the National Guard managed to disperse them. Without further hesitation, I left my house and rented another residence. I did this under an assumed name, not wishing to compromise any of my friends. During the interval between the landing of the emperor and his arrival in Paris, I had not felt worried about this, for hope of his success had allowed me to believe that I should later be able to reward an act of faithfulness, but now my presence could only be dangerous. I therefore shut myself up for several days alone with my children and received no prisoners. The Prince of Schwarzenberg, having established his military headquarters at my house, I felt I could no longer return to it safely. I was convinced that I no longer had anything to fear from the royalists, but their hatred of me still continued. If workmen in the suburbs made seditious remarks, I was alleged to have paid them to do so. Red carnations were at that time considered my emblem. I was recognized going about on foot in the most out-of-the-way corners of the city. In short, the defeating cause that had been abandoned by all, that lacked an army or support of any kind, still made the armed hosts of Europe tremble. And it was upon a woman that the leagued sovereigns fixed their eyes. The army had reassembled beside the Loire. Monsieur de Flahaut was already there. Monsieur de la Bataillere called to say goodbye to me. He could not bear to be separated from his wife, who had been entirely won over to his ideas. When I expressed my astonishment that he was still in Paris, he answered, "You are right. I must not allow myself to be captured. I should be deprived on account of my wife's family. I do not want to owe them anything. France is liable to suffer grievous wounds, but all her defenders are not dead, and I wish to join them in order to help free her from the enemies." The Emperor of Russia re-entered Paris. The protection he had offered me in the past was now more necessary than it had ever been. He was the only man I could hope would defend me, and although it would have been natural enough for me to ask him to do so, I felt too downcast, too broken-hearted by my country's misfortune to receive him again as a friend. Indeed, I hesitated whether I should receive him at all. My doubt did not last long. He did not make the slightest inquiry about me, left me all alone in the midst of the dangers which surrounded me, and seemed to wish to humiliate me. One day, when he and his staff had come to see the Prince of Schwarzenberg, he did not even come up to my apartment, where he had been so eager to call in the past. Instead of being offended by this disdainful attitude, I felt sorry for him. Thus, the same man whose attentions had at one time involved me in so many difficulties now left me at the mercy of any incident that might occur. He piteously abandoned me to the attacks of those against whom he might have been my sole defender. I could not help feeling for him and regretting that political matters had so changed his generous feelings, but his conduct could not humiliate me in the least. My role seemed the nobler of the two.